So at this time this morning, we'll segue into the juvenile department presentation, and we thank you for coming this morning.
Good morning. My name is Christina McMahon, and I am the Juvenile Services Division Department Director for Clackamas County. And with me this morning, to my right, I have Lisa Kurz-Marzik. She is our Senior Administrative Analyst in the Juvenile Department. And I also have our Assistant Director, Mark McDonald, here. The three of us are actually the people who worked to put the budget together this year. This was our first year actually preparing the budget. Last year, I walked in right after everything had been turned into the budget office. So this was a new adventure. Before I go on, though, I want to extend a very big thanks to the folks who work in the budget office. Diane, Roxanne's not here, but Roxanne has been amazing. Jen, we don't know what we would have done without them having three newcomers to this process. So really wanted to thank you for everything you did to assist us. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank the finance department. Seated behind me is Ed Jones, who's one of the accountants in finance, and they graciously lent Ed to help us as we were going through and making sure that we understood the process that the county uses. So big thank you to him. On this first slide, we actually have our new department mission statement, which was put together as part of our Managing for Results Performance Clackamas work. I wanted to let you know you're going to see our budget in the old format, and the presentation reflects that because we haven't finalized our actual strategic business plan. We have a pretty, we're almost there. We have a pretty final draft, but we still have some work to do with Dan Chandler to get it finalized. But it is clear when you hear the rest of this presentation that the whole process of going through managing for results greatly impacted how we looked at preparing our budget this year. I have some other information, but I heard you have a lot of work to do and a lot of time to catch up, so I'm going to skip that, and then I can answer any questions if people want to talk more about the managing for results work that we've done. So our mission is to provide prevention, intervention, and juvenile justice services to youth and families so that they can experience positive change, repair harm to the victims that they've created, and become contributing members of our community. Here we just have the kind of the overview of our budget. Our budget is just a little more than $12 million, as you can see from this slide. Roughly close to $8 million of that comes from the county general fund and makes up about 2/3 of our budget. Other sources of revenue, I'll talk more about this as we proceed, but some of these other sources have been decreased this year, so I'll explain that a little bit later. Okay, so in terms of our accomplishments and performance outcomes, we have, obviously, we're tied into the county's overarching goal of ensuring safe and healthy and, look, I have it right here in front of me and I'm going brain dead. Safe, healthy, and secure communities, the overarching county goal that other public safety and H3S, other public safety departments and H3S share with us. We are proud of the fact that this new measure, and I believe we talked about this last year when I was here, the 36-month recidivism, there was a call in Oregon to have a measure to track out for 3 years after a youth becomes involved with our department to see in the long term how are they doing. We actually have the lowest rate in the state. This is a brand new measure that came out this year. The lowest rate in the state for any medium or large county. So in terms of how we're doing in the future as we look out 3 years, it's 26%. Our chronic recidivism rate, which is the kind of the second section down, is really an important measure because that's the measure that captures what we refer to oftentimes as the high-risk youth, the frequent flyers. A very small number of kids are responsible for a large number of actual crimes being reported to the police. So we always want to be monitoring that and making sure that we're keeping that number low. We have the lowest rate, once again, of any medium or large size county, both when you look at our 12-month projection out and then our 36-month. So we're very proud of that. The next one, high degree of accountability to victims. In our performance Clackamas work, we identified who our customers were. And our customers are the youth who are referred to our department, their families, and the victims that the youth have offended. So when our Oregon delinquency code requires that youth are held accountable to the victims that they've harmed, and when we look at this, 93% of our restitution is paid in full by the youth who come to our department. That is the highest, if not one of the highest in the state. Last I knew, it was the highest in the state for any county. So we're very proud of that, and we've created a lot of programs. Mark has been involved in that over the years to try to make sure that we give youth opportunities to work, gain skills, and pay back the money that they owe their victims. And then in some of the other accomplishments that aren't tied specifically to data are the internal capacity development that we've engaged in the last year. Specifically, we've been working, as I've already mentioned, on our strategic business plan, which has caused us to focus on why are we doing what we're doing, what are we getting, what's the bang for the buck, are we really, now that we've identified our customers, are we making decisions based on getting the best outcomes for those customers? So that's really been I would call that a massive culture change in our department for the better. The other big thing that we've been doing is we developed a comprehensive data evaluation and research plan that digs even deeper in terms of what are the experiences of youth, families, and victims when they come to our department. Once again, I have more on that, but I'm going to skip it in the interest of time. Going next to our fund balance. So we have $1,850,000 that we believe will be our beginning balance on July 1. And that consists of $150,000 that's put aside in our contingency line item. Specifically, that's not a large amount of money, but we use that in the event that we have a youth who is in one of our contracted detention beds that we contract with Multnomah County to hold our kids in. If, for example, a youth had to have an emergency operation and was hospitalized, we may be responsible for medical bills. We've been pretty good over the years of working it so that we get parents to end up coming to the hospital and pay, but sign all the paperwork. However, as I'm sure all of you are aware, sometimes we have kids who really don't have a responsible parent that we can go after. So lucky for us, we haven't had to dip into this, you can see over the years, but we always could. Then the other issue is we depend pretty heavily on our vehicles, such as our community service work van. If something were to happen with that, we might need to dip into our contingency to replace. That's just one example. We do not have reserves in our budget, as you can see. We do have a fund balance that is projected to be 1.7 million, and that consists of our county general fund that's being carried forward, as well as what we refer to as our juvenile operations fund. Juvenile operations is basically a fund that was created about 3 years ago. This is our third fiscal year of using that fund. Back in the early 2000s, then Director Doug Poppin of the Juvenile Department lobbied very hard and was successful in getting an earmark from our federal delegation, and that earmark was set aside in a separate trust account to be used for juvenile services someday. And there was a hope at the time that it would be used to fund a detention facility. That didn't end up happening back in the early 2000s, but an audit happened, I believe, in the fall of 2014, and that money had to be moved onto the books of the Juvenile Department. So when that happened, there was also a corresponding gap in enough funding to cover the actual operating costs of the Juvenile Department. So this is the third year. For the last 3 years, we have been drawing down that account and putting it into our budget. This is, we believe, the last year that we will be able to do that. And obviously that will create issues for next year that we're already looking at, which I'll get to in a slide here in a couple of minutes. So we're also using the fund balance, even though we have that money coming in, we have some vacancies that have not yet been filled. We're in the process, actually, of recruiting some of those positions and recently filled some of those positions. So we anticipate by the end of the summer, the vacancies that we had intended to fill will be filled. So let's see, significant issues and changes. This goes back to what I said at the beginning about Performance Clackham is really having an impact on how we look at how we're doing our budget. So I have here the question that we're asking ourselves, we've been asking ourselves all year, and especially as we've been preparing our budget this year. How do we utilize our existing resources and increase partnerships to address unmet needs and service gaps to achieve better outcomes for the youth, the families, and the victims that we are charged with serving? So that has been the overarching question. We knew, Dawn was very clear and repeated it many times, that there would be no new policy level proposals this year. So we knew if we wanted to do something different, we could not come and ask you for extra money. And plus, with the position we're in with our trust account diminishing, we did not want to be growing our budget. So we really did a lot of work with our leadership team to identify what the gaps were and how we could address them by reprioritizing within our budget. So very excited about the first bullet that's listed here, our county-wide school threat of harm coordinator position. I think you've already heard this mentioned by the sheriff and Rich Swift at H3S, and it also involves our schools. That is a position to really coordinate some of the concerning behaviors that being able to address some of the concerning behaviors that we see going on in schools, especially we hear about the ones that make the media about threats of violence at school or plans to harm kids. And fortunately, that's a relatively small number, but very concerning and a major resource drain when those incidents happen. However, we have a very large number of kids who go to school and engage in acts of violence or threats of violence that don't rise to the threat of harm, the serious coming to school with a gun, for example. But they still are concerning because we know these young people have behavioral health and mental health needs that haven't been addressed. So this position is going to help us work together to coordinate how we respond and have a full continuum of services for those young people. So we're excited about that. That's being done with an existing position that was vacant that we're repurposing for this. And through the collaboration and oversight of these various agencies. The next one down, law enforcement collaboration and community monitoring program. For the last several years, even before I got here, you have heard us talk about the underutilization of our juvenile intake and assessment center. We are the only county out of 36 counties in the state that operate a 24/7 juvenile intake and assessment center. It is a best practice model. It is kind of the gold standard of how we should, having one of these centers is the gold standard of how you should be dealing with kids who are starting to become involved in delinquency or concerning behavior, because it gives us a chance to bring kids in, assess them early on, identify what some of their needs are, and get them connected to services sooner than later, waiting for the whole paper trail to follow. We have had issues in our community with that program being underutilized, because when police officers have to bring a kid into our juvenile intake and assessment center, that means they're taken away from the field. So when they're in waiting for us to do our assessments, that means they're not out in the field. And then if we do an assessment and we say this young person needs to be taken to the Donald D. Long Youth Detention Center, that means they have to turn around and once again be out of the field going to up to Northeast Portland to drop these young people off. So it can mean, even for the local, the police agencies that are close by, it can mean several hours out of the field. So it's tough for all of the agencies to maintain the level of public safety they want and still meet the needs of these young people. So what we've done is we've partnered with law enforcement. We've been having communications for the last about 8 months. We've put together a work group in our department. We are actually going to take care of doing the transportation of these young people so that we can bring them to our intake and assessment center and then get them where they need to go. Sometimes we can take them to another relative's home. We don't need to put them in a detention center. Sometimes we need to call mental health crisis services to come in and assess young people to make sure that they're not at risk for suicide. This has been met with a lot of enthusiasm because it will give us the ability to better serve kids and help our law enforcement partners. The other component of it, community monitoring, We do not currently have the ability to go out and check on kids in the community during weekday evenings or on weekends. This will give us, when we're not transporting for law enforcement, we will be out visiting kids and families, doing, helping families problem solve when they're having some sort of an issue in the moment on the weekend with a teenager who doesn't want to listen to the fact that mom has imposed a curfew, et cetera. So that's how we're maximizing the use of that. Once again, we are repurposing existing positions and doing this within our budget. That will be a 6-month pilot. We want to make sure that the utilization actually goes up. Right now, we are at a 45% utilization rate of all the potential kids who could be coming. Only about 45% are coming to us. So stay tuned. I'm hoping we'll be talking about that next year at our budget presentation. And then as kind of an offshoot to that, we are also in the process of increasing the types of assessments we're doing. There's a lot of talk, I'm sure it's come up in other presentations, about trauma-informed care. I don't think I need to tell anybody here, many of the youth that are involved in our department have experienced extreme trauma in their lives, and we're looking at doing further assessments related to that, suicide prevention, mental health, just really making sure that we're using the best tools that are out there for us, especially since we'll have more time. And then we are increasing, we have a partnership with ClackCo ESD for career, technical, and education services. We're going to increase the hours of our staff that is engaged in that work so that we can help young people find jobs, get those job skills that they need, do apprenticeships, and complete their education, whether that is getting their GED or helping them enroll at ClackCo Community College. So those are significant issues and changes that we're working on that we're really excited about. So our department-wide budget, as I've already said, we have over 12 million, roughly just a little bit above $12 million. The major points on this slide, other major revenue sources, you can see the state of Oregon represents 12% of our budget. We get our a lot of money that we use towards our residential services and our detention is passed down to us from the Oregon Youth Authority. We also have federal funds. You can see over the years that has really gone down. Only 3% of our budget now comes from the federal government. And then services for charge for services and other is related to the work that we do around the county for different towns, for Metro, different cities and towns, for Metro, even for our own DTD, related to our community service and restitution project payback programs that we have. So major expenditures, I looked, this really didn't change from last year. A little bit up on our personnel. As everyone knows, the costs of personnel don't tend to go down, they're rising. 53% of our budget. Our detention costs did go up this year, and they do represent 16, just for the 17 detention beds that we have at the Donald D. Long Center in Portland, represents 16% of our budget. And then our services and programs that we contract for, like our shelter, our foster home shelter beds that we operate, which youth can stay in for up to 90 days. We also have an emergency shelter, so when there's a blowout at home and we just need a few days, couple of days to figure out a safety plan, we have emergency shelter beds available. Contracted services include our diversion panels that we operate in 11 towns and cities throughout the county, which do incredible work and are really a wonderful early intervention and prevention tool to keep kids from penetrating further into the work that we do in our department. And then community treatment represents, we spend about $91,000 on community treatment. That actually is the contract that we have to be able to offer outpatient juvenile sex offender treatment in Clackamas County, which we are very fortunate that we have the ability to do that, because if we didn't, we would be committing many more kids to the Oregon Youth Authority for services if we didn't have that available. So let's see, moving on to the next slide. I think this speaks for itself. We haven't had a lot of major capital projects over the last few years. We did have, it says remodel kitchen. That's really referring to the kitchen, which serves as our kitchen and break room for our staff in our main building. That was done in the last couple of years, and then replace carpeting ongoing. So yes, I think we're almost done. That's been going on. When I walked in the door, one of the first things Ellen Crawford said to me, who she was working with me for a few weeks, she congratulated me on my brand new carpet that they had installed as my welcoming gift. They put me up on the list. So I think now everybody in that building has it. So, which is important because it really needed replacement. Financial trends, already talked a little bit. State funding reduction. The big one here is we have really three agencies that we get a lot of funding from. We have the Oregon Youth Authority. They're losing funding in their state agency budget, which will have an impact on us because they are projected to lose approximately 20 to 25% of their residential beds. So that means when we need to commit a kid to go and be placed in residential treatment that is above and beyond what we're able to provide as a juvenile department, there will be less of that resource available because everyone in the state will be competing for less beds. They are also reducing their youth correctional facility beds by 50, which means they will be moving those youth offenders out into residential beds, typically as a step down, which will also have a decrease in our access. We've lost roughly about 330,000 in state funding between the Oregon Youth Authority, the Youth Development Council, which we had been using to fund our diversion panels, which we're still going to use whatever we get from them, in addition to some county general fund. And then our Criminal Justice Commission has a grant for our juvenile drug court. That we're one of a handful of counties in the state that operates a juvenile drug court, and they the grant ends on June 30th. They did put out a solicitation for a new grant that's greatly reduced, but then we got a letter saying that they wouldn't be letting us know till August. So our budget reflects a position in the juvenile drug court program being eliminated that was a limited term duration paid for out of the Criminal Justice Commission grant. And that position is somebody who coordinates education access for youth who are involved in drug court and struggling with recovery, hopefully helping them stay connected to school, and also providing pro-social activities for these young people to replace the drug use activities that they used to be engaged in. And I see several of you smiling. Many of you have come to our drug court graduation, and it's really a great program. So expenditure trends, as I've already said, and we've had an increase in personnel costs. We had an increase in detention costs by $68,000 this year. Our daily bed rate went up from approximately $288 a day to $300 a day. That was a bargain after they originally requested an increase to $339 a day. So I felt that $300 was a lot better than $339. But that is a cost that continues to rise every year. So we are monitoring that closely. FTE, you will see in our budget, we actually reduced our FTE by 2 this year. That goes back to what I said earlier, really about Performance Clackamas and making sure that we're meeting the needs of our customers. We did an assessment of 2 juvenile counselor 2 positions. Those are the staff that actually do the probation cases that go to court. And we analyzed our caseload sizes and felt that we could move forward and still meet the needs of our customers, our kids, with reducing those 2 positions. It also is directly tied to the issue of the trust fund that I shared with you earlier. That had been funding 5 juvenile counselor 2 positions. So now in the upcoming year, it's set to fund 3 juvenile counselor 2 positions since we eliminated 2. Planning for future and sustainability. I know you had interest in knowing about succession planning. We actually at the Juvenile Department in the last year and a half have gone through our wave of retirements. We have no one left on our leadership team or even working in our department that is within the 5-year strike zone of retiring that we are aware of. So we've already been through that, but nonetheless, we're still working with our staff to make sure, and our leadership team, to make sure that we're providing professional development opportunities. We have been active participants in the Leadership Academy that the county offers, which we're getting great, the new season, we're getting great reviews about. We are also, some of those positions that I talked about, how we're repurposing, that's created internal promotional opportunities for some of our staff so that they can have chances to really engage in some stretch assignments and work on projects that they don't normally do. So that's part of our succession planning. I believe that is, I think I've done my speeding through this to the best of my ability. So I'm more than happy to go back and answer any questions that you may have.
All right. There are a number of questions, it looks like, so we are actually, we'll go down the line. Actually, Commissioner Humberson's done was first, I believe, and then we'll go down to Commissioner Savas and we'll then you.
First, commend you for actually evaluating your personnel and actually reducing by 2 FTE. That's rather rare. That doesn't happen very often. You indicated that you're going to take up transport responsibilities with juveniles that have to be taken to higher security facilities. Are your vehicles secure vehicles so that someone can't escape from the back, or do you transport in restraints?
No, we do have secure vehicles. And in fact, one of the things that we had already planned on is we needed another secure vehicle. So we have been in the process of purchasing one, so that'll give us even more.
I just wanted to be sure I had the experience of what happens when you don't have a secure vehicle at 55 miles an hour and somebody jumps out and almost takes you with them. It's not fun. The other is just something to think about in the future, not for this year, but one of the county college classes that we had at one of the counties has a program where they do a $2 an hour subsidy to local employers for summer employment. Obviously, that would would require a funding increase to your budget or something maybe in cooperation with the Economic Development Commission, I'm not sure. But it's something to think about in terms of youth employment in the future. And that's all that I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Savas.
Yes, well, thanks for all the good and honorable work you all do with our youth. It's important, extremely important, and I like your mission statement. I think it really captures everything that you're all about and why we feel this is valuable. My questions are more mathematical, I guess, and maybe staff can help. And I'm just going to take this to make it kind of have a clear understanding. Your goal here is to have your 16-17 amended budget, and your proposed budget shows a ending balance goal apparently of $150,000, but your ending balance in actuality has been in the neighborhood around $2 million, which is in green on page 9. I'm on page 9. So you're obviously the beginning balance is you're starting off in the proposed budget about $1,850,000. You identify that your reserve for future expenditures is 0 across the board, and contingency is the $150,000, so that is consistent. And knowing that you can reduce a couple FTE, and you're also relying on general fund support. My question is that do you feel that that beginning balance or your reliance upon general fund might be a little bit less? I'm trying to understand the carryover, and if you need a little bit less general fund, there'll be less carryover because we have a policy of 5% contingency and 10% reserves in the general fund in general and you are general fund supported. So I don't want to see it necessarily double, so we have 2 essentially reserves or contingencies. And so if that's your target, would you not be reducing that general fund support?
Well, so I'm sorry, I'm not an accountant, and I don't even try to play one on TV, but let me see if I'm following this, and if I'm not, please let me know. First of all, the carry forward amount, that includes that trust fund that I mentioned that used to be somewhere in the vicinity of $1.5 million that has now dwindled down, which is why you see in previous years, the dollar, the carry forward was actually higher because we had more money that had not been tapped into yet and wasn't being utilized. So that represents part of it. But to answer your question, no, I don't see our general fund at this point in time, when I look at what the contribution is. And, I had some talks with Diane about the maintenance level. I don't see that reducing. I can tell you that I really look at things from a lens of being a good steward of the public's money and not wasting the county's money. My first job as a juvenile department director was in Douglas County in 2005. I changed careers and I went to Douglas County, and at my interview, they said to me, okay, so the next year or two, we might not get this timber money renewed, and you're gonna have to probably reduce your budget by 20, 30, 40%. We don't know. How are you gonna do that? So I started my career as a juvenile department director, being very conscious of what am I paying? Should we have 2-ply toilet paper in the detention facility or 4-ply? I'm not kidding. It was that close to the wire. So for me, I've been learning in the last year where the areas were where we could make some adjustments. And as I said, we looked from within to see if we can move things around to meet unmet needs. I would not pretend to know that we are exactly right-sized yet. I can tell you that as part of that data evaluation and research plan that we're doing, we are looking at things like utilization, effectiveness. If we have a program where we're only serving a small number of youth and we're paying a lot of money for it, we will be looking hard at should we continue that program. If we're spending money on a program and we're not getting the results, and basically we're spending money and we could get the same result if we did nothing, we will be doing something about that. So I can't fully answer that because we haven't engaged in all of the evaluation. I think we've done a good job this year trying to figure out how we can move it around to meet the needs. But I guess I don't have a full understanding yet if there's still more that we could trim. We are carefully monitoring, as Commissioner Hubbardson said, from, noted our 2 FTE that we reduced. We will be continuing to monitor caseload sizes, staffing levels, et cetera. So I don't know if that answers your
Well,
question.
you're kind of getting, and this is more, I trust that everything you're saying as far as, and your intentions, or you're well intended. And then maybe this is more of an accounting thing. So if that part of that carryover is really part of a trust fund, maybe, again, this is more to staff over here on this side of the table as opposed to your table,
Well,
that perhaps a fund, if it has a purpose, if this balance has a purpose, it should be identified in a fund as such, as opposed to just a carryover balance.
Yeah, so the fund is actually being dedicated to operating expenses for the department. And because the fund has been drawing down over the years, the maintaining current levels in the juvenile department actually means a greater reliance on the general fund in the future. So we may be faced with a stronger challenge of balancing the books with the juvenile program next year.
So that maybe it ought to be put in reserves then, or identified as a reserves line.
It's not reserves though, it's actually being spent.
Right, this is the last year that we have money to even put into our budget. We anticipate, unless we have some unexpected savings, or the state comes back to us and says, hey, we decided we're gonna give you extra money after all. We don't see that happening, but we anticipate this time next year, we will not be coming before you with money left in that former trust fund that we had. So, but just to address as Dawn said, the issue of greater reliance on county general fund, that's why we are so invested in analyzing how we're utilizing our resources. So when I mentioned that we're paying for 17 detention beds at $300 a day, and they go up every single year, we want to make sure with this community monitoring program, we'll be able to assess and maybe if it's appropriate and it's in keeping with public safety, can we do something different with these youth than putting them in a $300 a day detention bed? Could we put them in an emergency shelter bed, or et cetera? So we're hoping that we can analyze so that we can keep the reliance on general fund to the lowest.
Now, my point was more on the accounting side, how we account for it, not necessarily what you're doing with it. So, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Wildif next.
Thank you. Just a quick question. The countywide school threat of harm coordinator,
Yes.
how, if at all, do they interface or have a relationship with the school SROs? And can you tell me a little bit more about, is there any other, like, report back to you or relationship between your folks and the SROs?
Yes, absolutely. We did a presentation to the superintendents of Clackamas County and explained the program. We've talked to law enforcement, all of the chiefs about the program. This has really been spearheaded by Sheriff Roberts. When I first got here, he put together just a group of us to talk about the issues. And a big part of what this position will be doing will be training the school districts and the SROs. In fact, Chief Johnson from Lake Oswego was able to obtain a grant for training 100 folks in Clackamas County on the threat of harm protocol, which includes the school resource officers. That's happening June 26th and 27th. So we've already started the work without the coordinator of putting together a body to oversee this. So the folks who are at the table, we have a representative, Michael Rawls from North Clackamas School District is representing the superintendents. We have Kim Yabara from Sheriff Roberts' office. We have Mary Rumbaugh, the Director of Behavioral Health here for Clackamas County. We have Michelle Barrera, one of our managers in the Juvenile Department. That group is going to oversee the work of the Threat of Harm Coordinator and will meet regularly. And there will be regular report outs to the superintendents and to law enforcement about the work that we're doing. So the Threat of Harm Coordinator will be boots on the ground, coordinating probably on a pretty frequent, if not daily, pretty close to daily basis with school resource officers throughout the county. So the message that we got from law enforcement was, we need to have a one-person point of contact. This is so convoluted with 11 different school districts, all these different police agencies. When something bad happens, trying to figure out on the phone tree of who to call can just be really difficult. So yes, we anticipate our person is really, even though they're housed in the Juvenile Department, it's a shared resource with the oversight by this kind of a steering committee.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Chair Bernard.
Actually, I normally would not even do this, but in your mission statement, I think you guys are doing great. I think the best investment we can do is in juvenile department, long before they end up in our jails. But in the one, it says repair harm to victims. I don't believe that's possible. Now, to recompense or reparation to victims, I can see that being one, but to repair harm to victims, I don't think that's possible. Unless somebody's just stealing $50 from them, you give them the $50 back, but that's generally not what happens. But anyway, that's just a comment, and I'd never even mentioned that normally. It just seemed odd.
Well, no, and it is where restorative, our philosophy that guides our juvenile department is restorative justice.
Yep.
So much of what we do is aspirational, right? We're hoping to repair harm to victims, and fortunately, the vast majority of offenses that we have, Chair Bernard, are property offenses. So, being able to pay back when you, steal something is possible. But when you physically harmed or traumatized another person, you're right. There are many times we can't repair the harm. So I agree with you.
Restitution is possible, but repair emotionally and otherwise is another issue altogether.
We do have to say that we have a wonderful program collaboration with Resolution Services here in the county, and they facilitate victim offender dialogues if the victim is willing to participate in that. Obviously, we can't force victims to do that, but we do get a lot of feedback that really helps victims move forward when they've had that experience. So that works for some people.
Commissioner Fisher, go ahead.
So some of my questions were answered, so thank you. But I do want to commend you and the work that you do. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And I really appreciated when Commissioner Humberson and I met with you early on in my being a commissioner. Was very useful. So one thing I've noticed in looking at the funding streams, and as we know, that's always so important to me, we've got quite a bit of general fund, we've got a little bit of federal funds, we've got some state revenue, and then there's a lot of other. And I went through the revenue and I've I've sort of picked out sort of the other, but we don't need to do it now. I just want to ask that in the future, we just set aside some time. I'm just concerned, I'm watching funding streams because I think we're in an unstable environment. I want to make sure that we as your commission can support you if we need to be ready to advocate to maintain any of our funding streams. We've got 2 million of other in this
Yes.
budget, and I just want to work with you. I want to be proactive on that. And then just a couple little questions on, I really appreciate it. I so appreciate your attention to performance Clackamas and managing for results. And it makes it so much easier for us as policymakers to say, yeah, this is what our money's going to, and this is what we're looking to do. I'm just, a couple questions on the, there is the, oh, I was just curious. One of your goals, it's on page 4, and it says that, well, it's the activity, no, wait, let me think of where the goal is. Identify youth who are at risk of being chronic offenders.
Yes.
I was just curious how you do that, and what's the measurement?
Well, one of the ways we do that is through the assessments that we do up front, which is one of the reasons we want to increase the use of our juvenile intake and assessment center. There's actually a validated tool that's been developed in Oregon called the Juvenile Crime Prevention Risk Assessment, and it gives you basically there's a scale, and if a young person scores high on that scale, their likelihood of going on to become a chronic offender is pretty high. So we want to be targeting those youth, getting them services so that they don't continue on that path.
Okay, thank you. I just wasn't connecting the dots as I was looking at the goals. And then I do want to commend our Juvenile Intake and Assessment Center. It's unique in the state, and being there, and if other commissioners haven't visited lately, or budget committee members, I suggest that you do that. I am curious why 45% to 60% are the numbers of the youth that end up there. Where do the other youth go?
Well, so over the last 5 years, the highest number, it's ranged between 45 and 48. Our goal is we want to get it up to 60% this year. We'd really like to see it more than that. But to answer your question, when kids are not brought into the intake and assessment center, a couple of things can happen. Law enforcement might call in and say, I'm in Sandy, I have a youth that needs to go to detention, and they drive them straight to the Donald E. Long facility. So that can happen. But the majority are, the referrals are sent into us, usually electronically or faxed to us, meaning the police reports are sent to us and the youth is never actually brought to the intake center or taken into custody. So we get more than half of our referrals to the department through snail mail or fax machines or electronic.
So basically, the numbers that we actually have are showing success because youth are triaged appropriately instead of coming to the assessment center.
Well, no, we want them to come to the assessment center because when the youth have the paper referral that makes its way in, they're on a slower path to be, when we have them in the intake and assessment center, they're right there in front of us. We can assess them, we can talk with them, we can identify issues and get them into services quicker than when they come in through that other route. So the intake and assessment center is basically a fast track to services.
Okay, thank you for answering that. I appreciate it. And we'll set some time to
Yes,
talk more about
we
funding
love to go
streams
over
and being proactive, and really appreciate what you do.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Ed? Yeah.
I just want to say that the assessment center is probably the best thing that ever happened in Clackamas County. It really is. Mark and I were talking earlier. And as far as being a deputy sheriff and taking somebody to the assessment center, I think it's the best wake-up call that we have. And I also wanted to commend you on the 36-month recidivism in here. That's very impressive. And I just have one question. If somebody comes to juvenile when they're 17, does that carry over to if they're arrested and put in jail? Do you keep track of that, or can you legally keep track of that?
Currently, the report, no. To answer your question, do we currently keep track of that? This is a statewide system report. No, they do not currently keep track of that. Legally, we are actually talking about how we can track that. We believe we can get permissions from some of the data systems that we would need to get into. And recently, actually, I was speaking to our elected DA, Mr. Foote, about that very issue about, the tracking, hard to track once they turn 18 because they're not located in our system. And that recidivism rate, there's about a 3% plus or margin of error, sort of like the Gallup poll, I guess, based on that continued movement past the 18th birthday. So even though the state hasn't gotten there in terms of developing a system that will do that, we believe that with the capacity we have, we can get there locally in Clackamas County because that's really important information to have. In terms of did they actually continue in criminal behavior after they legally became an adult. So yes, we're looking at that. That's part of our data evaluation and research work.
One more question and then just a comment. What do you do with the threat of harm with no SRO at the school? Like,
There are patrol officers that sometimes will respond depending on what it is, but the threat of harm coordinator will be working really closely with school personnel as well. And then if there are patrol folks that are covering the school. So one of the things Michelle Barrera, our supervisor, is doing is working with the various people within the law enforcement agencies that have been identified. It's great that we have buy-in from the chiefs, but we need the people that are connected to the folks on the ground working with young people. So that's one of the things she'll be working through. She's already started meeting with folks.
and then a comment, the transport for deputies, that's just awesome. It just saves us so much time. And the other thing is, I really like this, is how do we utilize our existing resources and increase partnerships to address unmet needs and service gaps? That says it all for everybody in Clackamas County. That's what we need. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Schrader.
Yes, once again, everybody has said wonderful things. I will ditto all of that. Okay, good job. So my question has more to do with workforce because you said you are essentially increasing your services related to education and employment opportunities for youth. That's on page 5. So I pulled off Clackamas Workforce Partnerships, and I'm looking at the Job Corps piece. And find this is the free education and training program, eligible young people at least 16 years of age, qualify as low income. And then it looks as if they have C-Tech services. So I guess my question, pretty direct question is, are these the two groups that under the umbrella of workforce that you are directly contracting and working with?
We are directly contracting with C-Tech.
Okay.
Workforce, we're not directly contracting with. However, the person we have who works through the C-Tech grant is very connected to other opportunities, and some of those come to her attention through different workforce opportunities. But this is a particular area that we're really, and I remember having a conversation with you a few months ago,
Yeah.
Commissioner Schrader. This is an area we're really zooming in on because in terms of recidivism, we have older youth, getting them job skills and helping them to be employable is critical. So there are some other things that we're looking into, but it's premature for us to kind of chat with them. But we're trying to think outside the box. I know that we recently entered into a contract with the Ant Farm in Sandy, and that's through partially funded through BLM, and that's going to create some other employment skill-related opportunities for young people. So.
Okay. And what I was mentioning these specifically because they're partners under the umbrella of Clackamas Workforce Partnership. I mean, that's the nonprofit workforce board. But when I try to, because they have monthly meetings where they bring everybody from the ESD together. I mean, there is a workforce school education presence there, and I was curious as to who you were really connecting with. So you don't do very much with the Job Corps at all for
No,
GED
we've had
development?
kids who, Mark, and you have more of that
Yeah.
history than I do. We've had
With
kids who've
Job
been-
Corps,
Yeah.
not directly with Job Corps, but we have vocational components as a part of that C-Tech relationship. And Vocational skill building partnerships have been established with Parks Department. We have parking rangers, but we will definitely look closer at that workforce opportunities to expand. I actually sit on a committee that talks about workforce opportunities as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think that's our last question. So we want to thank you for coming and presenting and answering our questions and the good work you do with.
Thank you so
our
much.